Welcome to the Clinical File. I'm John Cordray, and I'm a licensed professional counselor, and this is my mental health analysis of the John Allen Muhammad, aka the D.C. sniper case. These are my speculations, not a diagnosis of anyone involved in this case. What causes a decorated military veteran to transform into a calculated predator who views an entire metropolitan region as a tactical kill zone? The psychological unraveling of the mind of John Allen Muhammad offers a terrifying look at how a fractured identity, when combined with intense personal loss and a pathological need for control, can manifest in extreme violence. We have to look at the early indicators of a personality that eventually felt it was his right to play God with the lives of strangers. His early life was defined by significant instability and abandonment, which often serves as the primary breeding ground for deep-seated attachment disorders. John Allen Muhammad was born John Allen Williams in New Orleans on December 31st, 1960. His mother died of breast cancer when he was only 3 years old, and his father subsequently walked out of his life. Raised by an aunt and grandfather in Baton Rouge, he grew up in an environment where the primary figures of safety were gone before he could even process the loss. This early childhood trauma created a fundamental void in his psyche regarding trust and emotional regulation. When a child experiences such a profound abandonment, they often develop a hypervigilant need to control their environment to prevent ever feeling that helpless ever again. Can a person's desperate need to regain a sense of family lead them to manufacture a substitute reality where they are the only absolute authority? Muhammad joined the Louisiana Army National Guard in 1978 and eventually transitioned to active duty in the United States Army in 1985. On paper, his military career was successful, as he became a combat engineer and earned expert ratings in marksmanship. However, the military structure provided more than just a job. It provided a rigid framework for a man who lacked internal stability. In the military, Muhammad found a surrogate family and a clear hierarchy where he could measure his worth through precision and rank. But beneath the uniform, his interpersonal relationships were beginning to show signs of a similarly volatile possessiveness. His first marriage to Carol Williams ended in 1985 amid allegations of domestic friction, and his second marriage to Mildred Muhammad would become the catalyst for his ultimate psychological collapse. Psychologically, Muhammad began to exhibit signs of narcissistic injury whenever his domestic authority was questioned. And when Milgram began to pull away, his reaction was not grief, but a calculated retaliatory obsession. The primary red flag here is the transition from a partner to a perceived enemy who must be neutralized through total control. In 1999, the breakdown of his marriage reached a breaking point when Mildred filed for divorce and obtained a restraining order. Muhammad responded by kidnapping their 3 children and fleeing to Washington State. This act of parental abduction is a profound indicator of a personality that views people, even his own children, as extensions of his own ego rather than independent beings. He wasn't acting out of parental love. He was acting out of a pathological refusal to lose the possession to a legal system he did not respect. How does a man who has lost everything decide that the only way to find peace is to inflict a state of absolute terror on the public? While living in a homeless shelter in Bellingham, Washington, Muhammad met a young, vulnerable teenager named Lee Boyd Mavo. Mavo had been abandoned by his own father and had a strained relationship with his mother, making him the perfect target for a predatory mentor. Muhammad didn't just meet Mavo. He systematically groomed him, filling the void of a boy's absent father with a toxic blend of discipline and radicalization. From a clinical perspective, this relationship was a shared psychotic-like dynamic, where Muhammad projected his own grievances and tactical expertise onto a malleable youth. He renamed himself as Muhammad after joining the Nation of Islam and began molding Mavo into a human weapon. This was the ultimate expression of Muhammad's need for control. He created a loyal soldier who would execute his will without question. The pair began traveling across the country in a blue 1990 Chevette Caprice, a vehicle they modified into a mobile sniper's nest. This modification required precise planning, showing that their future actions were not impulsive outbursts of rage, but cold, methodical operations. The psychological shift from a disgruntled ex-husband to mass murderer was fueled by a sense of perceived injustice against the state and his ex-wife. His motive was likely twofold: to create enough chaos to eventually regain his children and to extort millions of dollars from the government. The first known killing linked to the pair occurred in February 2002 in Tacoma, Washington, involving a friend of Muhammad's ex-wife. This choice of victim highlights the targeted nature of its initial rage, which would soon broaden into a generalized hatred for the public. If a person feels they have been discarded by society, do they eventually view every member of that society as a legitimate target for their pain? By the time they reached Washington, D.C. area in October 2002, Muhammad had fully rationalized the killing of innocent civilians. On October 2nd, the spree began with a shot through a window of a craft store in Aspen Hill, Maryland, followed by the murder of James Martin in a grocery store parking lot. And the following day, on October 3rd, it was a descent into logistical horror as 5 people were murdered in separate locations across Montgomery County. James was mowing a lawn. Primaker was pumping gas. Sarah was reading a book. Lori was cleaning her car. And Pascal was walking down the street. The clinical significance of these targets were mundane and random. Muhammad chose victims who were engaged in the most basic, safe activities of daily life. By striking people at pumping gas or buying groceries, he was attacking the very concept of public safety. This is a hallmark of a terrorist mindset where the goal is not just the death of an individual, but the psychological paralysis of the entire community. Muhammad was no longer just a murderer. He was a choreographer of fear who thrived on the media coverage and the frantic police response. The sniper attacks continued with a chilling precision that baffled investigators who were initially looking for a white truck. Muhammad and Mava were hiding in plain sight in their sedan, using a hole cut in the trunk to fire from a concealed position. This level of deception indicates a high-functioning sociopathy where the perpetrator enjoys the intellectual superiority of outsmarting the authorities. Every successful shot reinforced Muhammad's sense of grandiosity and power, a direct counter-narrative to the man who had been a homeless father under a restraining order. On October 7th, the duo targeted a 13-year-old as he arrived at school in Bowie, Maryland. The shooting of a child marked a significant escalation in the psychological warfare Muhammad was waging against the region. Even the most hardened criminals often have a code regarding children, but Muhammad had no such boundaries. His willingness to target a child demonstrates a complete lack of empathy and a desperate need to show the police that no one was safe. At the scene of the shooting, investigators found a death tarot card with the inscription, "Call me God." This is a massive psychological red flag indicating a messiah complex and a desire for divine-level recognition. Does a desire for notoriety become more addictive than the act of the crime itself once the perpetrator realizes the world is watching? The duo continued their reign of terror, killing Kenneth at a gas station, Linda outside a Home Depot, and the pressure on the community was immense, with schools going into lockdown and people zigzagging across parking lots to avoid being a target. Muhammad was feeding this collective trauma, likely feeling a sense of accomplishment that his tactical training was being used to hold a nation hostage. However, his own arrogance began to create cracks. During a phone call to the tip line, the snipers bragged about an unsolved murder and robbery at a liquor store in Montgomery, Alabama. This was a critical mistake born out of a need for validation. Muhammad wanted credit for his work, even if that meant giving the police a lead. The Alabama lead led investigators to a fingerprint on a magazine, which was eventually matched to Lee Boyd Malvo. Once Malvo was identified, the link to John Allen Muhammad was quickly established through military and immigration records. On October 24, 2002, the two were found sleeping in their Chevy Caprice at a rest stop in Maryland. The arrest was made without an incident, a jarring contrast to the violent chaos that they inflicted over the previous 3 weeks. When Muhammad was taken into custody, he did not present as a raving lunatic, but as a calm, disciplined individual. This calm demeanor is often seen in individuals with antisocial personality disorder who view their crimes as logical solutions to their problems. Throughout his trial, Muhammad's behavior remained consistent with a man who believed he was the most intelligent person in the room. He even attempted to represent himself in court, a classic move for a narcissist who refuses to let anyone else control the narrative of his life. He showed no remorse for the victims, viewing them merely as tactical milestones in his grand plan. The psychological profile of Muhammad is one of a man who suffered from a profound sense of narcissistic mortification. When his life fell apart and he lost his family, his ego could not handle the reality of being a failure in the eyes of society. To compensate, he created a scenario where he was the hunter and everyone else was the prey, effectively flipping the power dynamic. His execution in 2009 via lethal injection marked the end of a life defined by a desperate, violent quest for significance. The victims of the D.C. sniper attacks were not just people who lost their lives, but an entire population that lost its sense of security. The trauma inflicted by Muhammad and Malvo lingers in the psyche of the region, a reminder of how one man's mental health crisis can become a public health catastrophe. Understanding the why behind Muhammad's actions requires us to look at the intersection of trauma, military training, and a personality void of empathy. He was a man who used the tools of a protector to become a predator because he could not cope with his own internal instability. The red flags were present for years: the domestic volatility, the parental abduction, and the grooming of a young compliance. Had there been a psychological intervention at the point of his first domestic breakdown, the outcome might have been very different. Instead, his grievances were allowed to fester until they transformed into a lethal ideology of revenge. The case of the D.C. sniper remains a primary study in the psychology of dual perpetrator crimes and influence of a dominant older mentor. Muhammad provided the tactical knowledge and the rage, while Malvo provided the youthful compliance in the execution. It was a case of a shared madness where the two reinforced one another's delusions and justifications for murder. The precision of their crimes was a reflection of Muhammad's internal need for order and a life that he felt was chaotic and unfair. By analyzing the behavioral clues left at the scenes, we see a man who was communicating his pain through the barrel of a rifle. The Call Me God card wasn't just a taunt, it was a psychological confession of his deep-seated feeling of powerlessness. As we look back at this case, we have to recognize that the signs of extreme violence often begin with the breakdown of personal relationships and a refusal to accept loss. Muhammad's inability to process his divorce and the loss of his children led him down a path where he viewed the world as his enemy. The tragedy of the John Allen Muhammad story is that it was a preventable slide into darkness if the early indicators of his mental state had been seen and addressed. His legacy is one of fear, but it also serves as a critical lesson for law enforcement and mental health professionals alike. The transition from a domestic abuser to a mass murderer is a path paved with specific psychological markers that we must learn to identify. His life ended in a Virginia prison, but the questions about his psyche continue to challenge our understanding of human cruelty. How many others are currently walking a similar path, fueled by resentment and looking for a way to exert control? We must remain vigilant in recognizing the red flags of isolation, radicalization, and the pathological need for dominance. This critical file aims to peel back these layers to understand the human element behind the headlines. The victims of October 2002 deserve to be remembered not just for the way they died, but for the lives that they were living before they crossed paths with a broken man. John Allen Muhammad's story is a sobering reminder that the mind can be a weapon just as dangerous as any firearm. By examining his motives, we gain insight into the dark corners of the human condition, where ego and entitlement override the value of human life. The psychological impact of these events continue to be felt by the survivors and the families of the deceased. As a counselor, I see the ripples of such trauma and how it reshapes the way people interact with their world. The D.C. sniper attacks changed the way we view public spaces and the trust we place in our neighbors. Muhammad's actions were a direct assault on the societal contract, driven by a man who felt the contract had already failed him. As I conclude this analysis, we are left with the reality that some individuals are capable of extreme compartmentalization. Muhammad could be a father, a soldier, and a neighbor, while simultaneously planning a spree of random executions. This duality is perhaps the most frightening aspect of his psychological makeup. It reminds us that the people who commit these acts often look like anyone else until they decide to step out of the shadows. This is interesting to look at John's past history. He went to the military. He didn't really have parents. He didn't have really the adult authority and support and love that he needed. He went into the Army. There's a lot that the military gave him, but it didn't give him the support that he needed when he was younger. We don't know a lot about his childhood or growing up. My guess is he probably had a rough life. A lot of trauma and then probably abuse in his life, a lot of neglect, not a lot of emotional bonding or connection. And he found that eventually by going into the military, got structure and a lot of tactical knowledge. And unfortunately, he used that tactical knowledge to create a lot of mass murder and chaos throughout the nation. And it's just really unfortunate that he found this young man, Mavo, and his life was interesting as well. I didn't have time to really look at his life and how he was so easily brainwashed, essentially, because he needed an older mentor, and he found that in John, unfortunately. And this is tragic on so many levels. It's so, so sad. And it created a lot of fear in the country. I remember when this happened. You probably do too. And everywhere you went, if it was somewhere public, you wondered and kept looking, and probably some people still do because of this case. So what did you think about this case? Were there any elements that stood out to you? If you want more mental health analysis of true crime stories like this one, be sure to subscribe for more. And if you found this case compelling, be sure to watch this next story. It will make you more aware of your surroundings. Thank you for joining me today. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe.